Okay, thank you very much, Linda. Nice introduction. It's exciting to join you folks tonight. I wish we were in person, but this is the next best thing. I understand I'm in a series about railroads, so I just want to tie in a little bit and say that railroads were very instrumental in the growth of agriculture. And you probably heard railroads were just important in a lot of things in the mid 1800s when they first came through. And so for New Hampshire, it meant producers could send products to Boston. We had milk going to Boston. We had grains coming to England. It allowed our dairy industry to expand. It also had some negative things because it brought wool and some other lower priced goods to New Hampshire, and probably had a lot to do with the demise of the sheep industry because the West could grow sheep and wool a lot cheaper. So I have a map actually that shows all these little milk stands all up through the state where the railroad would stop and pick up cans of milk and take it to Boston. So definitely a tie-in. Excited to do this talk. It's interesting features of old barns. I don't give it that often. It's actually one chapter in my new book because authors always have to show off their books. And Catherine's been very supportive of this book at the Bookend store in Warner. And if you want to get the whole book, it's there. In fact, I think she has some stickers to put a little Benjamin Franklin Award on it that I got this spring. So this was a chapter in the book because I wrote it. People are, as I gave my other lecture, asking questions or looking puzzled about some of these things I talked about with barns, and I realized a lot of people hadn't seen the inside and didn't know some of these features. So I've kind of split it up into some different categories, and I'm going to start with architectural features. And you've got to start with the framework of what we call the bones. And if we go into a barn, you just can't help but be impressed with the framework, the size, the scale, the beams. These were very ruggedly built. They were overbuilt. In fact, some people wondered why they use such big timbers. But I think one reason was it meant you didn't have to hew so much because they were dealing with big lumber when they came to this region. And so big timbers meant less hewing. And so they used these big structures. They built bents, that's what these units are called. Every 12 foot, there'd be a vertical post and so forth. And it's just a tremendously strong structure. In fact, some of these could be actually moved, just by towing them as a box because they were so tight. Inside, on the left, or on the, I don't know which side you're seeing here, but the gunstock post, this is where they flared them out at the top. So they intersected with the roof members and the rafters. And it gave more meat for the intersection of many members. You had roof bracing that would support the structure. And every barn had its unique things, but basically the early barns, you had this post and beam. And with the real early ones, you had the major rafters with purlins going horizontally and the boards going up and down. The one shown in this picture on roof bracing was a later barn, and this is what we call the common rafter, and now they're starting to put the boards horizontal. Then they had what they call a drop plate. After the 1850s or so, they started having a little more decoration, a little bigger soffits, and by having the drop plate, a part of the rafter could stick out and create a soffit. As you'll notice, the real early barns, the rain almost ran straight down from the roof down the walls. And later they built these overhangs, and by having a drop plate, you could run the rafter out and create a soffit. This is just a great picture here with that floor structure. Those are old pegs that held down some of the floor structure. On the side, you see some boards. A lot of times those boards are put up because they would thresh grain. And the boards to keep the grain in the floor, not going into the haymow. And then you have these girts shown on the other side, the sidewall. And again, just massive structures. The main points of support were under the major beams, but sometimes they put a solid stone wall all the way through. Then you had the ridgepole, various, like I say, different builders had different styles. This ridgepole example is extra bracing, more than you often see. And when they put these together, they put marriage marks, and you can see these Roman numerals so they would know what joint and what beam went together. Okay, so moving along to other things under this category, doors. You often found the doors in the corner of the building, like this example, because if you put a door in the middle, they're probably not going to find it. But you put it at the corner, they will. And most of the early doors were swing-out doors because those hinges could be made by a blacksmith. And because we were talking pretty basic stuff, not a lot of hardware, and a blacksmith could flatten out these strap hinges and you'd have a corner door. And then later, we were able to do roll doors and so forth. And this barn is shown in this picture is an example of an English barn characterized by the doors under the eaves. And the later barns were Yankee, and they had the doors on the ends. And then our further sophistication of doors was the pocket door. And that is very practical in New England. And it sits inside, it rolls inside. It means you have to design for it because normally there'd be a big support timber where that door is. So they either carved out the beam or set the beam back 4 inches so they could run the doors. And often the door had a little wheel on the bottom front corner, on each corner, so they rolled easily. These rolled really nice and very little affected by the weather. Yeah, like I say, cow doors, usually just a single opening, usually in the corner, sometimes in 2 corners. Like sometimes the barn would be divided in half and have heifers on one side and cows on the other. And this would allow the cows to go in and out. And in those early days, cows usually get just a couple of chances to go out a day to get water. We didn't have running water in the barn. So twice a day, the cows would go out these barn doors out to a water tub. Okay, windows. These are examples of horse stall windows, and they're very characteristic of being small and up high because horses tend to chew and play with them, and so they'd be protected and be up high. Generally in barns, cow barns, you'll see 3/3 pane. You hardly ever see a double sash window, and my reasoning for that is they probably wouldn't work because in a cow barn, there's a lot of moisture, and it would be hard to get them to move in the wintertime. And they'd have a single sash, and generally they would open in, and they'd have a little nail or something, and they could tip them in and use it for ventilation. Okay, internal features. Again, I want to move along. I want to show you a lot of things here, and I just kind of randomly came up with these headings. But the cow stable, I would say that probably over 90% of the barns built in New Hampshire were probably dairy barns. Almost everybody had 6 or 8 cows and made butter as a cash crop. There were some specific sheep barns. I've seen a few of those, but a lot of them would have had dairy cattle. And the telltale sign are the stanchions. And you can see a row of stanchions here. The tie-up styles show these old wooden types that were used. They were fairly restrictive, but the cow would be let out usually twice a day to drink. And then in the stable, you have the gutter and the scuttle hole, and that would be for manure about every, 6 or 8 feet or so. Sometimes will find a lift-up door, and that allowed you to push the manure down and save a lot of labor and cleaning. And then the cows were hitched in stanchions, and later we did pipe water in and had water piped in the water bowls, but that actually led to the demise of the barns a little bit because they weren't made for having water in them. Cows are known for slopping their water bowls, and you always can tell that the cow side of a barn is always the side that rots first because of the water and urine and everything. The feed area characteristically was a front with drop-down doors or lift-up doors, and you would pitch the hay off the scaffold or off the haymow or over the platform over the cows down into the hay floor, and then pitch it into the front of the cow. And they generally would close these down in the winter to keep the stable warm, but they would open them to feed, and in the summer they'd be open for ventilation. That bottom corner shows what that would look like. I actually found one with a cow in it to illustrate this. And I mentioned haymows. That was up in either the second floor, or usually these barns had cattle on one side of the barn, a center haymow, and then a set of barn floor and then a hay mow. So often the hay was stacked from the floor clear to the ceiling. This is an example of some dividers in the hay mow that help get from blending together. This loose hay really used to mat together. In fact, they even had saws for sawing the hay to spread it apart and get it so they could pitch it out. This shows different ways to get into the hay mows, and a lot of these barns have these built-in ladders, either an actual ladder like you see in one example, or pegs, and the farmer would go shimmying up through there to get his hay. You see on the one example with the pegs, a little bit of whitewash in the background, and that's an indication that this probably was an upstairs stable, and in the 40s and 50s, it was required that cows be milked on concrete. So a lot of cow stables moved from upstairs to downstairs, and the telltale sign is that whitewash, because that was required to have in your milking barn. Up in the hay mow, up above, you'd have what we call the flying scaffold. This was earlier, this was like your extra hay you put in last, but then when the hay fork came in, it actually served as a delivery area for pitching down to the hay mow. So what you would do is you would drop the hay down onto the flying scaffold and then pitch it down and make use of gravity. And then there are a lot of different ways of having hay holes to get this hay pitched down. If you had a second floor, trap doors, or some kind of a framework, because the loose hay would be gathering around things, and you had to make areas to keep open to pitch the hay. And I mentioned the hay fork. That was a pretty big deal when that came through. A lot of these were built by the Loudon Hay Fork Company in Iowa, and they claimed to have had hundreds of thousands of these all through the country. And you had a track up in the barn. And sometimes when that came through, a lot of people cut braces and posts out of their barn to put them in, which was kind of the downfall of some roofs, because it weakened the barn, but it was in the way of the hay fork. And there are different grapple sizes and shapes, as you can see in the photo. But these would be pulled on the rail, and then the fork dropped down into the hay wagon outdoors, and or in the barn, and then pulled up with an extra horse outdoors that would pull the rope. Then the hay crew would holler when they were ready to the right spot and ready to have it dropped, and they would drop it, and the horse would stop. And then later, there was another invention. You don't see many of these. I've only seen one or two of these in all my travels, and that is an electric hay fork. And that's an electric motor, an electric system. And I saw their ad for this. It said it eliminates a horse. You hook it up, and you can run electricity. But it actually was a short-lived invention, because it probably came into use in the 30s and 40s. And then pretty soon after that, we had the baler around 1948 or 49 with the balers. So there weren't too many of these around, but it was an attempt to mechanize the hay fork and eliminate a horse. Okay, I'm going to move to another section. Like I said, these are just different. I came up with ventilation. People like cupolas. I get a lot of calls from newspaper people and photographers. They love to photograph cupolas, but they are more than decoration. These were part of the ventilation. They ventilated the hay mow, but they also often shared ventilation with the barn as well. And sometimes they were quite decorative, but they were functional. And then later, we had these commercial ventilator units that were put on the barns that were cheaper than the cupolas, and they would be put generally on these gambrel roofs. But as I said, sometimes the cupola shared ventilation with the stable, and they literally built these chutes. You can see the chute going up the side of the barn and up to the cupola, and then down in the cow stable would be a little door. So you would open this little door, and it would let the air up through, and it would go out through that cupola that also shared ventilation with the hay mow. And this shows a little more Baden barn with those commercial ventilators. Okay, I just call this other section accessory features. That's kind of a simple thing, but stairways. You'll always notice in barns, stairways tend to be narrow and steep. And I think the reason is they didn't want to waste space because they had too much rise over run. It would spread out and eat up a lot of space. And they always had little steps and narrow. They either went down to the basement or the second floor, or they sometimes led up into the cupola. Most of them had a way to get to the cupola, and I think people used to view from there, and they seem to like to go up there to check things out, and probably for maintenance and opening and closing windows. And then animal ramps. Cattle actually are quite good at going up steps or ramps to change elevation. And this one on the left, this covered one, he goes up an angle and lets the animals into the barn. And the beginning of that ramp is the other side that shows the granite steps. And cows will negotiate these very well and then go into the barn, through the ramp. And another thing you see a little bit, not as much, is the internal ramp in the basement. And these are actually in the basement of the barn, and they kind of wound up into the barn. And it was used often if they had a barnyard outside of the basement, or some even had wells with a water tub in the basement. And it's amazing to think that a 1,200-pound cow could go a rise of 8 feet in this short amount of distance and get out into an upstairs stable. The thing very unique about this barn, which I haven't seen other places, it came up into the middle and it allowed cows to go either to one stable or another stable. Usually these are at one end of the barn and the cows go up the steps and enter in. And like you say, normally it was used for letting them in and out in the winter for watering to a downstairs tub or an outdoor barnyard. I call this other auxiliary features, just a whole bunch of miscellaneous things. Silos. I get a lot of questions about silos. They came into use around the 1880s. Actually, some of the really early silos are actually bunker types in the ground that were patterned after the Indians and the Romans. In fact, there's one remaining in the Quintown section of Warford. Is a huge bunker that was a bunker silo predating the 1880s. But around the 1880s, the land grant scientists were doing research on preserving fresh feed and preserving it and fermenting it like pickling almost. And then you'd feed it out in the winter and it was much better quality. Now, originally the silos were inside the barn because a lot of them were square because they didn't have the milling capabilities to make angled lumber, and they were afraid about silage freezing in the corners outdoors. And the telltale sign for an indoor silo is either big dormers or some kind of a lead-in door into the roof, because most hay barns didn't have any type of opening into the roof unless it was for a silo. And also another telltale sign is sometimes you'll find a foundation in the basement of a barn that's been boarded over. Then they started building kind of these octagonal type outside, and then finally the round type outside. And then we went from wood to, there was a tile stave type that was built. They looked like a red brick. It was concrete stave. And then there were the metal round silos, the harvest store blue ones you sometimes see. So that was kind of how the silos evolved. And then, ironically enough, today we're back to bunker silos again. We're actually using the bunkers. They're easy to build, more capacity per dollar spent. You can overfill them and round them over the top, quicker to unload, quicker to load, and so forth. And those are the things you see around the countryside, covered with plastic and weighted down with tires. Okay, barn bridges. This is a way to enter into what they call the high drive into the barn. Uncovered ones, we used to call them wharfins. And I don't know, I guess my family kind of used that term. I have seen it in books some. So we had uncovered ones called wharfins. And again, that's a naval term. But a lot of them put a bridge over it so it preserved the planks. This naturally looking one, was up at the Poor Farm, one of the biggest ones, and the one with the cattle was up in Bath, New Hampshire. But you'll see these a lot, and these led usually to this high drive that raised up a little bit and allowed them to pitch the hay down versus having to pitch it up. And I mentioned high drives. This is what that was. It was a high drive that went up into the peak of the barn more. You entered it through the barn bridge, and then a lot of your hay pitching was all downhill versus pitching it over your head. And you can see these barn bridges are amazing. This one, you can see here, it goes the whole length of the barn, a huge structure. Another term, a windlass. And you may notice a lot of these are naval terms. And I think because probably barns and ships were the two biggest things being built back in those early days. And so a lot of the things in barns, they kind of use the naval term. And so windlasses were common in barns for lifting heavy objects. They often used it to change the hay wagon body off from the wheels, or to lift a butchered animal up for skinning and, butchering it and so forth. Sometimes they were real simple. This is one that's just a slot that held a peg. It was a big peg with some turning handles. But you look at a lot of barns, there'll be some sort of a piece like this on the end, and that was used for lifting carcasses and generally fall butchering, because that would be cooler weather. Just a simple grain box, but those are often built in, sometimes in a little corner. Sometimes there was a grain room. Sometimes they were beside the barn floor, and that's where the farmer would go to get the grain, and then he would open up those front doors on the hay mangers where I showed you before, and individually dump the grain into the cows. And these boxes are silk smooth. In fact, some antique people like them because of they're so special with their smoothness. You just can't recreate that smoothness of 100 years of grain flowing over the wood. And even something as simple as hooks. Everything in a barn had a purpose. These were, frugal old Yankees, and everything had a purpose. And when I go into barns and see hooks, I often want to imagine what that was for. And sometimes it'd be a horse collar. Sometimes they had these rigs for the bull. There'd be a bull rod that they would have. Sometimes a cow halter. Sometimes just the farmer's overalls and milk stool. Another thing that can be an awfully good find in a barn is the storage cabinets. Now this one, it was up in I think it was in Moultonboro, and it was almost intact. And it had breeding records, it had medicines, it had information about crop yields. You can find some very interesting things in the barn cabinet, because that's where the farmer kept his breeding records, the cows that calved. Oftentimes they had hatch marks for the amount of hay or corn they put in or whatever. And so these can be very revealing. And then everybody gets a chuckle out of outhouses. This was a classic one that I found. And mom, it's a pop, mom, sis, and I think there's a little one on the side that said baby. And sometimes they're in the connector link of the barn. And people who don't know much about outhouses, they say, well, why in the world would there be three, and would three people be in there at once or whatever? But if you know anything about outhouses, the real practical part of this is that as the winter goes on, it gets stacked up, and you had to move over another one as it stacked up, and by spring you had to clean it out. So that's probably the practical reason of the three-holer. Okay, another thing, carriage sheds. This is a real fancy one. I'll have to admit, this is one of my few out-of-state photos with such a special place. It's a carriage shed with a turntable. And allowed them to push the wagon in, and then they could rotate it and shove it off on different sides. So they could put several wagons in here, and then when they wanted a wagon, they'd pull it onto the turntable and spin it. It had a big handle with a lot of advantage on it to push, and they'd push it around, line up the horse, and hook on. I've seen very few of these. It's a very special thing. Okay, just I want to keep moving along here. I know things go kind of long when you're looking at Zoom, but we're getting kind of toward the end. And a topic I call barn modifications. One thing is just changing the support structure. Actually, USDA published some books around the 1900 advising New England farmers how to make their barns more efficient to compete with the West. And one was to remove posts and then drop rods down so that they could turn horses and turn loads and so forth. Other things they've done, sometimes they will add turnbuckles or rods to hold it together, because sometimes these barns tend to spread. And this is an example of that internal truss that you would do if you were removing downstairs posts. And there are some barns that actually were built this way, and these rods go clear to the roof. There's a barn in Chichester, New Hampshire, that has no posts, the entire basement, and it's all rods going to the ceiling. And there's some of these barns around the state, but they would construct a truss over where the posts would have been, and then they run the rods down, and it's based on kind of the truss system we use now for building houses and barns. And especially done in livery barns. There was a livery barn in Durham that was a service for students years ago, and they wanted to be able to turn the wagons and the horses, and so they put these trusses in. And this one here is over a carriage shed as well. Okay, another traditions. You know, as agriculture grew, the barns grew. And we started out with those English barns that had the doors under the eaves. They were sometimes added onto the ends, which was kind of an awkward addition because it created a big space between the stables. But the Yankee barn that had the doors in the end, not under the eaves, they would actually put addition on the back, like that angled addition, or it's very common just to add more of the same. They're very easy to add to. In fact, the telltale sign of an added-on Yankee barn is that the last one or two bays may not have a joint connection to the original barn because they were a butt joint. I discovered one of these at the Farm Museum in Milton. I was looking around and you could put a piece of paper between the last set of beams and the addition. There was no joint. So that add-on addition, very common, often used for heifers. It was a way to expand the farm. This big one in the middle with a big long addition, I'm not sure, nobody's sure if that was original with the barn or added. It's so smooth and slick, I almost think it was added with the barn, but it was an addition, and in the deeds and things it was referred to as wood storage, and now they use it for machinery. And then of course milk houses came along. Now in the real early days, most of our dairy farmers made butter, and they probably brought it in the house and did a lot of the work on it. Then the farms expanded, and interesting enough, the public health officials had a rule that a milk house couldn't be attached to the barn. They were concerned that there would be manure contamination and odors, and so your milk house had to be so many feet from the barn. And you'll see some of these as you ride around the countryside. You'll see this little milk room, 25 feet from the barn. But say nothing about lugging the open pail of milk from the barn through the grass and through the flies to get to the milk room. And finally, they decided, okay, the milk room can be added to the barn, but there has to be a vestibule with two swinging doors, and the door toward the barn had to open out, so if there were flies on the door, they would ride on the door into the stable and not ride on the door into the milk room, and then you went through a second door. Our barn at home had these two doors. It was a real pain for lugging milk because you'd open one door, the next door would hit you in the back, and then you'd kind of go through the next door, then you'd dump your milk. Eventually, that rule went by the wayside. You could have a single door as long as it was self-closing with a strong hinge. So that pretty much wraps up my talk. And if we can do questions, if you want to open up that way, that's fine. I didn't want to belabor this because I know it's a little different venue when you're on the Zoom like this. I wanted to move it along. I wanted to show you a lot of illustrations. And so Lynn, if you want to facilitate a question time, I'm open to that.
So how about if you stop sharing your screen and then we can see who's wanting to talk.
I'm not sure if
Oh,
that's
I
doing
think
it.
I might be able to do it there. I could do it since I was a co-host.
Okay, thank you. Okay, you want to do some questions?
So if you have a question, just unmute yourself and ask away.
John, can you tell us when the hay fork was developed? You said it was added to some barns.
Right, it was around 1850, and that's about the time that the Yankee barns became popular. And of course, this worked better in the Yankee barn because it was a long barn. There were some reinstalled into old English barns, but around 1850, and like I say, that Loudon Company in Iowa claims to be a chief manufacturer and said they had them all over the country.
Thank you.
So 1850 is when the railroad came through Warner, right around then. So some of this switching over to the Yankee barn, would that have been another result?
I think it was related because 1850 was definitely the heyday of New Hampshire agriculture. Like today, we kind of joke about, it's tough making a living farming, the margins are tight and so forth. In the early 1800s, farming was a profitable occupation, and it had to be very profitable around that 1850s time. That's when a lot of barns were built. If you're dating barns, you're going to see a lot of 1850 barns. It was the heyday of New Hampshire agriculture, and I think it was broken open, by the railroad and opening up all those markets in the city, so we weren't limited by our country markets. We are now supplying cities.
John,
Yes.
this is Rebecca. I was in an old English barn recently in Warner, and you entered through the door in the middle of the barn, and it had three bays. You walked into the center, and on the far right up against the wall, was this wooden railing. And so I walked over to it. I said, well, why is this railing here? And it went the whole length. It was actually built into the barn originally, and you could slide it over to create space. I'm assuming it was for sheep, for fencing, to pen them in. I had never seen
on the floor level.
Yeah. And I had never seen that before.
I haven't either, and that could have been. Sheep were a big thing, and they were part of a lot of farms, and I have never seen that feature. That's very interesting.
I'll send you a picture.
Okay. Yeah, I just mentioned sheep were a big thing in the 1800s, and we did have some sheep barns. In fact, now that I know what I know now, I think we owned one back at home in our farm. And the characteristic of a sheep barn is that it opened to the south. It had open doors in the basement to the south. It only had hay storage upstairs, whereas most of our barns had a few cow stanchions. A true sheep barn was open to the south, no evidence of animal housing on the second floor, all out of the basement, all running outdoors, and only hay storage. And we had a classic one on our farm in Lebanon. I'm convinced of that now. It got torn down and moved to be a special thing in Lyme, New Hampshire or something. But I think it was a classic sheep barn. I've seen very few of those because a lot of barns weren't built that special for sheep because they didn't need that much housing. So they would put little shacks out in the pasture or whatever. But there is such a thing as just a sheep barn, and it would have no evidence of cattle and no evidence of second floor housing. If there's a lull, I'll just mention another thing. I didn't think to put this in the slides, but another thing that I have seen in a few barns is a built-in weigh scale. It was common for, like one of the farmers in the neighborhood might have a weigh scale, and then if hay was being sold or coal or whatever, they would come to this one farmer and they get things weighed. And I've seen a few barns around the state that have those built-in scales. Usually it was Fairbanks, and all the apparatus is in a box near the haymow, and the whole drive-in floor is suspended on the scales so that you could weigh the hay or whatever. Any other questions? Maybe I missed something. I want to clarify something.
I have a question, John. Are there any unique features or clues that you look for when you go into a barn to try to get a sense of how old it is or when it may have been built?
Yes, there is. In fact, when I enter a barn, I call it reading the barn. The first thing I do is I just stand back and start looking. The first thing I look for are beams, and I'm going to give you a really quick rule of thumb for dating a barn, which comes out pretty close. If you go in and the big beams are hewn and the braces are hewn, you're in the 1700s, and we don't see many of those. If you see hand-hewn big beams and vertical saw marks on the braces, that's probably 1800 to 1830, and they were milling out the small lumber at vertically operated water sawmills. If you see hand-hewn big beams and circular saw marks on the braces, it's probably 1830 to 1880. And if everything appears to be sawn, big timbers and little, probably 1880 to 1910. They were building big post and beam up to around 1910. Then they started to shift to what we call balloon construction. And even then, they had some of the big beams, but they had 2x4s in between, because now they had the milling capabilities to make smaller lumber. Because like I said, these early barns were way overbuilt, but they were just using the big lumber that was in the woods and preventing a lot of hewing and using big timbers. So that little rule of thumb comes out really close. The thing that will throw you off, and it's fooled me before, if for some reason there was a really early sawmill in that neighborhood, that could throw that dating off. Because sometimes there might be an early circular mill or an early vertical mill. And I know I was way off on a barn in Plainfield once. I had it dated to late 1800s, and it was 1830, and they had one of the earliest sawmills in the neighborhood. So I've learned now, when I start dating a barn, do you know anything about sawmills in the area? Because that will throw off that little dating scheme. But that little dating formula works it'll come out pretty close. And then after that, I look for the type of boarding on the roof, whether it's common rafter, that is rafters every 2 feet, or major rafters every 12 feet with horizontal purlins, and the boarding going up and down. The up and down boarding is usually an indication of an earlier barn. Horizontal boarding would be a later one, and it would have common rafters.
When you say early versus later with the purlins and rafters, is 1830 kind of that early versus later time period?
Yeah, 1800, 1830, 1840, and then the Yankee barns, most of those came in using some different architectural things. Around 1850, you started seeing more of the common rafter and the horizontal boarding. But from 1800, 1830, 1840, the major rafters, horizontal purlins, and then boards going up and down the roof.
Thank you.
I have a question. Our barn, can you hear me?
Yes.
Cool.
Go ahead.
Our barn was built in 1829 here in Warner, and in the back section, the back left corner of the barn goes 3 stories high. It's boarded in at the basement currently. There's a big granite, 3-sided granite under place where I think the sheep went. And then this cavity goes all the way up to it's all open up into the loft of the barn. We thought it was for hay storage, but as you were talking, I wondered if it might have been grain.
Or it might have been an internal silo.
Yeah.
Internal silo. That would be, then they would put either wet silage, like wet corn silage. That sounds like a silo spot.
And it was concrete on the floor.
I bet that was a silo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Silos and they're inside. Yeah.
Thank you. I learned something new there. And then the under part, like I said, is the 3-side granite. And then upstairs, there were a few cow stanchions, and there's a little room with a milk paint. So we know that was the milk room. But it was primarily for sheep here, I think. It was an inn, and the shepherds stayed when they were driving the sheep to market and what have you. So as you were talking, now I'm thinking maybe it was a sheep barn, and just later more cows were added as the wool industry declined.
It could be, because a lot of these sheep people converted to dairy, once, the sheep industry declined.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
John, could you speak to the state of the current preservation of barns in New Hampshire? Like, how many are we losing each year? Are there programs to preserve some of the barns? How many still left? That sort of thing.
Okay. Several years ago, I made up a number that I thought there were 20,000 barns in New Hampshire, and that's been quoted ever since. And I just made it up. But I didn't just fictionize it. It was based on the 1900 census, said there were 20,000 people, 20,000 farms in New Hampshire producing milk. Now, that doesn't mean commercial farms. It just means they were making milk of some sort. The commercial number was probably half of that. But I figured if there were 20,000 people making milk, there were probably 20,000 barns, and that was kind of the peak of things. And so far, there have been several farms that have done barn surveys, and on the average, we're finding 65 to 80 barns per town, and there are 240 towns, I think, in New Hampshire. So my estimate that I made up several years ago, they're discovering by research now, is probably true. But we are losing them. Some people claim, I don't know, we're losing a barn a day. I think that's a little exaggerated, but we are losing some, due to, disrepair or being put into people's homes for decorations or whatever. We do have the New Hampshire Preservation Alliance, and they're overseeing the barns in New Hampshire. We have the Barn Committee, and the Preservation Alliance has what we call barn assessment grants, where they will help share in the cost of a barn contractor to come and look at your barn, assess it, and set priorities of what needs to be fixed. But we don't have money for actually doing what we call a brick and mortar work. We don't have money to help you fix them, but there are cost share monies for assessing a barn and evaluating it and deciding what you'd like to do to have it fixed. Unfortunately, a lot of our old barns are owned by widow ladies who've lost their husband. It was in the family, and they're sitting there with limited funds, and a lot of them are going into disrepair. Just the people just don't have the money, to fix them. On the positive side, just lately, I've had an increased number of out-of-state people buying up New Hampshire places that appreciate the barn, and they're having me come there to say, how can we preserve this and preserve this history? So there is a little bit of a turn in ownership lately with some of these abandoned dairy farms being bought by well-to-do people who want to fix them, but a lot are owned by just native New Hampshire folks that don't have the funds. And what we tell them is to try to at least do the minimums, keep the roofs fixed and the foundations fixed. If you don't, it's gonna go into disrepair. So we do have a lot of barns that need help in New Hampshire. We don't have funds to fix them.
John, can you speak about the applying for the barn easement and the preservation stuff?
Yeah, thank you for mentioning. I should have mentioned that. We have what we call 79D, and that's an easement program where you can apply with your town and get approved for an easement so that your evaluation will drop. And as you fix the barn, they don't increase the value on it, the assessment. And that's just it's a fairly simple thing to do. You want to get it in before April 1st, I think, or April 15th. And you fill it out. You have to get approved one by one with the town. Not every town has been agreeable to this, but most towns have given an honest look at it. I think there are 603 barns that have been under this program now in over 100 towns. So over half our towns are participating. And chances are, if you give a good case and go through the process and make your application and put pictures and so forth, you might get accepted, and it will help you on your taxes and keep them from going up. Otherwise, there was a disincentive for fixing barns. If you fixed it, your taxes went up. Thanks for mentioning that.
How might someone go forward with putting a case? Is that through just our town, or is that a process that you guys could help us with?
We would prefer that you work with your town, get the procedure, the paperwork, and try to just go through it. If you need some historical background, some of the historical places can help you. And in some real key cases where we thought they were just setting some really bad precedents, our committees, myself, I've helped on a few to help them out. We prefer you carry them through yourself. Normally isn't that bad a deal, but if you do get into problems, do let us know. We've written letters of support. I've gone to hearings. Whatever we need to do, we would help out.
Thank you.
Nick?
Yes.
Rebecca here. We can help with the history part. And we usually go to the selectmen when the person is making their presentation.
That's good.
Okay.
That's very good.
Our paperwork is halfway filled out, and we're trying to figure out what our next steps are. So
The paperwork isn't all that hard, and I think if you make a good, honest case, they look at sometimes the public benefit. They look at how visible is it and different things. But if you can get the history behind it and make a good case, most towns have been pretty receptive. The ones we've had the toughest time with are barns that have been converted to garages and things, and they really don't look like a barn anymore. And that gets to be hard to convince the selectmen. They don't want to set a precedent for preserving two-car garages.
Dan Watts pointed out in the chat that information about preserving barns is on the town website with links from there.
And don't forget to run down to Bookends and buy a book. Any other questions? Like I said, this is a little different talk. This is literally one chapter out of my book. I wrote this chapter in the book right from this talk. I had done this talk prior to doing the book, and then I liked the picture so much that I had on this talk. We actually used that for the cover of the new book.
Thank you. I have a question.
Huh?
Can you talk a little bit about barns that are in the middle of town? And
Okay.
why-
Yeah.
But have stanchions of some sort.
Right, I'm glad you mentioned that. That is another type of barn that we call the village barn. And the village barn had a pretty standard floor print of 1 or 2 cow stanchions, a horse stall, a chicken pen, maybe a pig pen, and a spot for a carriage. And that's called your village barn. It's often with your Victorian houses. And today they're 1 and 2 car garages. In fact, I know Warner has quite a few of these, and once you hear about this, you'll start looking just like I do when I go through town. I look at these little Victorian houses with this little tiny barn out back, and that was a village barn, and they were generally, owned by professionals, and even a doctor would have to have a horse and maybe a cow for milk for his family or whatever. And so those are village barns. We write about those in the book a little bit. Not a lot is said about those, but they have I've seen a few intact ones, and it's a standard little floor plan of cow space, horse space, carriage, and so forth. They're very nice, and if they're intact, they're pretty special.
So would the cow be if we have one that we think was owned by a lawyer?
Yeah.
He would hire out someone to milk his cow?
Or himself or his family or whatever. Like I say, even the professional people had these because they had a horse. And a lot of people did, produce their own milk for their family. In fact, some people were nervous about buying it on the open market because in the early 1900s, there was some tuberculosis and brucellosis issues with milk. And some people got really nervous about buying milk, and they felt safer producing their own. But it wasn't uncommon for professional people to have a little bit of a subsistence farm at their place.
Great, thank you. How can you tell a horse stall from a sheep or a cow stall?
Okay, usually it's wider, a little bit longer. Usually has some solid sides on the side because horses often kick on the sides, and they put sides. And usually the fronts will be all gnawed up because horses chew a lot on wood.
Yeah.
But it's usually a bigger stall that you picture like a draft horse or a driving horse, and with solid sides and usually a hay feeder in the front, and a little bigger than a normal stall, and no really hitching thing. They would usually be hitched with a rope and not with a stanchion.
Great, thank you.
Does anyone else have a question? Well, I'd like to thank John for zooming in with us this evening. It's always a wonderful talk when you come in
Well, thank you
Warner.
very much. This was kind of a dry run. This is my first real complete lecture by Zoom. In fact, this is my practice. Next week, I have a national one for the National Barn Alliance on Wednesday night. So this is my first run on a real, all the way through complete lecture by Zoom. So
And
thank you.
I sent out the link in the e-news, but if you didn't see it, just let me know and I can send it out again.
Okay, that will be my barn book lecture on the history of agriculture as told by barns. I was asked to do that as part of a series for the National Barn Alliance. And Lynn, thanks for being a good coach to this. Lynn did a dry run with me during the week, got me removed the anxieties, and thank you for your help tonight.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure. Well, everyone, you'll notice in your email, there should be an evaluation form that we fill out for New Hampshire Humanities. So if you could fill it out and email it back, that would be wonderful. And thank you very much and have a lovely evening.
Okay, and thanks again. You're a great audience.
Thank
Good
you.
night, everyone.
Night.